What's up guys, TechLab here. Now in today's video we're going to be taking a look at something brand new that was sent to us by Gelid. These are thermal pads for obviously your CPU and cooler. They sent along some for Intel and some for AMD. They are not usually something that I would actually use. I tend to just use thermal paste and make sure it's spreaded evenly, but I thought we would take a look at them and see if they could actually just make our lives a little bit easier in the studio. So the thermal pads that they actually sent to us are their latest edition. They are the Phase Ultra from Gelid. And to be honest, at the point of recording this video, they're not even available to purchase. What they actually sent along to us was just two little baggies with the actual thermal pads in. We have a couple each, two for Intel, two for AMD. We don't have any of the retail packaging or any of the instructions, so I'm kind of gonna go from some of the pictures they sent across just to actually install this, but we will give it a go anyway. I don't tend to use thermal pads myself. I'd like to use thermal paste, and the one that I generally use is MX4. I don't know why, it's just one that I like and it seems to work perfectly fine. I will do at some point change up to something like an MX5 or 6, but while I've still got a lot of this stuff around, I'll probably just keep using it. But for today, we're going to actually test out these thermal pads and see if they actually are any better. Now, when it comes to thermal performance, I don't know if they're actually going to perform any better. There are some very decent thermal pastes out there and they've worked for a long time. So can you really improve on thermal paste? And in fact, well, if you actually look at a thermal pad, all it is just a thin layer of thermal paste anyway. But they do promote these more heavily on the fact that they are easier to install. So we're going to test that theory. Now to test that theory, we are going to be using one of our test rigs, and I've actually attached it to our Cooler Master test bench here. What is on this motherboard here is a 12700K, and this CPU is a bit of a furnace. So of course we're going to get the best results from this, or at least see if it's going to, perform as good as what they actually say they are going to do. For the cooler, we're going to be just using our standard Noctua tower cooler. Now I've had this cooler for a while now, and we do run it with Redux fans. We usually run it with the twin fan configuration because we have the extra kit, but for today we're just going to use a single fan just because we want it to properly soak up heat and get very, very warm. So we're going to actually be attaching it to this board, and we're going to see how well these things perform, and then obviously we're going to see how well they are to actually apply. The first thing we're going to do though is of course use thermal paste. We're going to use our standard MX4 thermal paste, and then we're going to do a bit of testing, and then what we'll do is we'll clean it all off, we'll swap to the new thermal pad, we'll do a bit more testing and see if there's actually any difference. Now in normal videos I don't tend to show you guys how I actually apply thermal paste, and that is because it just creates so much controversy online that everybody has a different way of doing it. But today I'm going to show you that because I think it's better for you guys to understand how we're going to do it, and then that gives us a better comparison. So before anybody jumps into the comments and starts being a keyboard warrior about how to apply thermal paste, this is just how I do it. There are many different ways. You can watch many different videos on the best routes and the best ways of doing it, but today maybe you'll learn something, maybe you won't. Let's just try it out anyway. What I tend to do is I generally have the CPU here, and as you can see our 12700 does have a contact frame on it. It is one from Thermalright. They do help with temperatures a little bit, but I kind of just put it there to protect the board because we continually have coolers on and off this system. But what I like to do is I like to just put the thermal paste into the middle. And then I like to get the little spatulas that they provide. This one is from Arctic 2. I'm pretty sure it came with that thermal paste. And then I like to spread it nice and evenly all the way across the IHS until we've actually got a full coverage. Now, this isn't always guaranteed to work, but generally I find that it just works perfectly fine. And when we're testing coolers in particular, it gives us a equal footing because it means that the thermal paste application is going to be the same every single time. Now, once I've spread it all the way across, and you do waste a little bit doing this, I will admit, because you're going to get it stuck to the spatula, what I'll do is I'll generally just smooth it down, make sure there's a nice even coat across the whole CPU, just like that. And then we're ready to actually install the CPU cooler. Now this cooler is pretty easy to install. All it does is it's going to just mount down on top of its brackets. It is already clean on the bottom, and we're just going to lay it down just like that, and then we'll just get a screwdriver and just tighten the cooler down. With the heatsink attached and it's nicely firmly on, we're going to attach the fan. For this I'm just going to install the one fan, and I'm not going to go for a push-pull configuration. We're actually just going to go for a push configuration, and that way we can replicate it next time. Very easy on these coolers. You've just got these little kind of clips on the sides. You pull them back and they spring load over the top of the cooler, and that's pretty much there. Just make sure we plug in our fan and we're good to go. So now we'll just get this hooked up to a monitor. Let's run some tests. Let's get it nice and warm and see what the maximum temperature the MX4 can actually hold. So we've got the system up and running. It's running pretty cool and quiet, and we've got a few applications here. I'm just going to try and actually find our fan control software, because what I want to do is actually ramp the fans up to 100%. Hopefully you guys don't hear too much of that, but if you do, that's fine. We're not really here to talk about this. We're here to obviously test it. Now with fan control open, what we'll do is we'll bump that CPU up to a bit of a faster speed. Hopefully it should start getting up to 100% soon. It is starting to spin. This is a Noctua Redux fan, so I'm not 100% sure what the maximum RPM is. I think it's about 1800 RPM. So it's around 1700. That's where it's kind of capping out now. Minimize that, and then we'll take a look at the temperatures. We're currently getting an average temperature here of around 14 to 15 degrees. It's reasonably cold in the room at the moment. It's about 15-16 degrees, so that's actually working perfectly fine. Let's just kick off a multi-core Cinebench run. This is Cinebench R23. It's the only one that I've got installed on the system, and we'll see what we can actually max this out. Now with the test starting to kick off, we can see that the CPU temperature is starting to rise. We're currently getting around 63 degrees on the CPU core, or the package should I say. We're getting about 65 degrees now on the CPU package, which isn't too bad for the CPU. This one actually is one that rockets right up, and you can get it to hit 100 degrees quite easily depending on the cooler you've got. We are getting a slight increase. We're now up to 69 degrees, but we'll continue to let the run go. We've got it on a 30-minute test, and we'll see how much it can actually cap out and see where that kind of limit is. Okay, so the test has now been running for over 10 minutes and the temperature just isn't going anywhere. We're currently around 80 degrees C, and the maximum temp over that 10 minutes has been 80 degrees C. So this cooler with the one fan and the Arctic MX4 is managing to hold this CPU pretty well, particularly considering what CPU it is. So I think what we'll do now is we'll just shut the system down. We'll stop the test because there's no point continuing to run it. And then we'll swap over to the thermal pad. We'll run the test again and see what the difference is. Okay, so we've taken the CPU cooler off and we've cleaned it all down. There's no thermal paste on that or the CPU anymore. So it's time to actually install one of the thermal pads. Now, there are two different types that they send us, or at least they sent us. I'm sure they will provide them to everybody else. They have the one for the AMD, which is this big square one. And then they have the one for the Intel, which is a little bit more elongated. I'm hoping that it will fit our CPU perfectly fine, which it kind of appears to. I'm not exactly sure which one you would use for Intel LGA 1700. It seems to be the exact size and shape of an LGA 1700 CPU, but maybe you can just use this one and it kind of overhangs a little bit. I don't have any retail packaging, so I don't have any instructions, but I did actually see some of their pictures, and what they did is they actually applied it to the CPU cooler. So that's exactly what I'm going to do, and we're going to try and figure that out on how to actually do that. The CPU cooler will go that way round, so we will want our thermal pad to go kind of that way around, I suppose, because of the way that it's actually built. But in theory, I think all we do is we just take this and peel one of the edges off. Not sure which one actually matters at the moment. We'll see which one comes off. So it's the kind of transparency one is the one that kind of comes off the easiest. We will then apply it to our CPU cooler here. Make sure we get it in the middle as much as we can, and then we should be able to just peel it off, but it doesn't seem to want to peel off, so we'll stick it down a bit more, see if we can get it to actually stick to the cooler so that when we peel this side off, it will actually come off. So that has actually peeled off, okay, but it has left some on the strip. I'm not sure if, well, I'm guessing it's not supposed to do that, but it has left a little bit on the strip. It's not in the center of the CPU, it's actually on the one edge. So if you are going to be installing one of these, be careful when you do that, because you don't want that kind of gap. I'm thinking that it'll actually just squish out into that gap anyway, so it's probably not going to affect the performance. So let's just get it installed back onto the system, and then we'll rerun our tests again. Okay, so the system's all back up and running again with the Gelid Phase Ultra thermal pad and not the Arctic MX4 thermal paste. Everything seems to be running fine. There's no issues so far. I'm going to just bump the speed up on the fan just so that we can get it up to 100% like we did before, and then we'll take a look at what the kind of stock temperatures are, or at least the idle temperatures. At the moment, it is currently at about 18 degrees, 19 degrees, which is about roughly what the room is. As we said before, it hasn't really changed that much. It is fluctuating between 17, 18 and 19, so that's perfectly fine. In idle, it's working just as good. But we'll kick off our Cinebench test now, and we'll leave it running for probably about the same amount of time, 10 minutes, and then we'll get back to it and see what kind of temperatures we've got. So the test has only been running for around 30 to 40 seconds now, and to be honest, we've actually had a much bigger initial jump up in temperature than we did with the Arctic MX4. We're currently running at around 82 degrees, whereas if you remember, the Arctic MX4 actually only jumped up to around 60, so that's not a good sign for this thermal pad straight away, but we'll leave the test running. We'll see what the maximums come out at, as long as it can hold it at a reasonably decent temperature. Maybe it's not as good as the Arctic MX4, but maybe the ease of application can actually overcome that for many different people, and it'll be perfectly fine. So let's leave the test running and we'll see what it kind of ends up at. Now the test has been running for about the same amount of time. It's just about a minute short, but we are actually getting nowhere, so we're going to stop the test here. The thermal pads actually on this CPU maxed out at around 89 degrees C. That's actually not great compared to the MX4. It's not kind of terrible for the CPU. It's kind of handling it perfectly fine. But obviously we know that this cooler can do much better, so people just wouldn't be happy with that. But I am quite interested to see if the application that it actually made onto the CPU maybe actually some of that issue. If you remember from when we were actually installing it, when we actually peeled it away, it actually had a little gap inside it. I was hoping that the thermal paste or the pad itself would actually squish into that. What I thought we would do is actually just pop the fan off, pop the cooler off, and we'll see what kind of coverage the applications had. Now I'm going to admit that the actual pad itself is much stickier than the Arctic MX4, and to be able to get it off we had to give it a bit of a twist, and as you can tell, and I'm sure you guys can see this, it actually left a big hole in the middle. Now that hole is present on the actual CPU, but this stuff is actually much drier than the Arctic MX4. Maybe thermal pads are, I don't know, I've never used thermal pads before, but I wasn't too happy about that. We can actually just peel this up. It feels like a piece of plastic. Well, actually we can see it's actually quite dry, to be honest. Quite surprised at that really, because I thought it was just going to go into like a nice gooey mess when it was warm, and this cooler is quite warm still. But as you can see, the issue with the kind of gapping, which would have been down here, actually isn't there. So it did actually squish into that thing. You can see there's a rim around it. It did actually squash all the way across, but I don't think the pad itself is actually wet enough, if that makes sense, because thermal paste is supposed to be pasty. This is actually quite dry. We can actually just pick it off and peel it off, and it doesn't leave any kind of marks. So I don't really know what to kind of think of this thermal pad. It's not something that I would generally use, because of the obviously the temperature problems that we saw there, and it doesn't really make application that much easier for us here, because I can just get thermal paste. I've done it 1,000 times now. I can just add it on straight away. And as well with thermal pads, it depends how many they actually give you in the box. I don't know, because I didn't get the retail version of this, but if they only provide you one and you're paying for just one thermal pad, and they'd have to be really cheap compared to thermal paste, because even the cheapest thermal paste kind of performs a little bit better than that, then if you accidentally kind of install it wrong, or if it does get any gaps like we had when we were installing it, you're going to kind of be stuck really, because you've got no more in the tube as you would with thermal paste. But anyway, that was my look at the Gelid Phase Ultra thermal pads. Not for me. Maybe it is for somebody else because of ease or something like that. Maybe with a lower CPU, like a 65 watt CPU, it would actually behave perfectly fine. But on something like this, I would just probably go with the thermal paste that you know actually just works. So anyway, let me know in the comments below what you think of thermal pads in general. Do you actually like them, or do you use thermal paste? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I'm sure as always, we'll catch you guys in the next one.